Well, welcome back to another Guns Contractors video. Today I want to continue my maintenance theme and talk about tracks, steels, rubbers I have on my smaller machines, all tracks. If you are new to excavator owning, and this applies to all sizes of course of machine, then this hopefully will be a useful video for you. If you're thinking I need to replace my track, or I need to know how to maintain it and look after it, I will try and explain all of the points here in this video across a couple of machines to demonstrate what I mean. So stick around, hope you enjoy the video. Please subscribe to my channel. I do try and do as many of these tips and tricks as I can, and a like and a comment would always be welcome. I enjoy engaging with those of us who are keen on plant. So let me get talking about tracks. So for those of you new to owning excavators, maybe you just haven't had too much to do with tracks, these are a set of metal tracks. I also will talk about rubbers in this video, and the basic components are the same for each different type of track, and it's your application that means that you might want rubber tracks as opposed to metal tracks. And metal tracks will generally last longer. They're obviously a lot harder wearing, but there are disadvantages because, of course, being metal, they will damage finished surfaces especially. So it tends to be that smaller machines, generally kind of 8 ton and below, are on rubbers, and larger machines are on metal tracks. Now this is an 8 ton machine here. This is on metal tracks. Because of the application, the types of work that it does. You could of course fit rubber pads to the top of these. They bolt on with the standard pads. So there are, you know, a kind of a multitude of ways of doing it. A lot of cat machines have those tracks as standard. So there are ways of kind of having the best of both worlds in a way, but that's the basics of it essentially. However, this machine's a lot easier to talk through the different components of, so I'll explain the different parts of your track assembly and what each bit means. So first up, there's always a drive end. In this instance, that's this end, this machine. You can tell that's got the big hub and you've got your sprockets there. You've also got the other end of the deal is an idler. Now, normally the idler would just be a smooth wheel with normally a line in a ridge in the middle of it that keeps the track kind of in place at that end. That's the end that does the tensioning. This is the end that does the driving. When we talk about sprockets, talk about idlers, that's what it is. Now on my 8026, the idler looks like a sprocket. It's got teeth, but it's still an idler. It does not powered, and it's still the bit that does tensioning. So you then have, some run to the mud here, normally a top roller. That in this instance has just got one. Some machines have two, depends on the length of the track frame really. And then you have bottom rollers, which are the ones down the bottom here. There'll be half a dozen of those or so. Now, if you're buying a machine, you want to check that, you know, those things aren't completely worn out. These things live in the mud. You can't grease them, you can't oil them. That's just how it is, and they will eventually wear out. So something to check. You can jack the machine up, obviously using its own arm, and get under there and see if you can turn them. So sometimes you see they seize up, then they end up with a flat spot, and then you never get them round because of course you have a wheel with a flat spot, it's just going to sit in the flat spot, isn't it? And then they wear down like flat, and it just wears all your tracks out and all sorts of things. Now, something unique to steel tracks is that you have what they call pads, which is the bit on top, and then you have the chain, which is the bit that actually goes round the sprockets and the idler, right? Now you can change these. You can change these for wider ones, you can change them for shorter ones, say ones with rubber blocks, etc. And you can also, your pads may well outlast 2 sets of chains, depending on the sort of work you do. So steel tracks are a little bit different in that you can change the components of the track in order to save cost and outlive other parts of the machine, whereas with rubber tracks you pretty much have to buy the whole rubber band because it's all made as one, right? So they're if you find a machine with worn tracks, it may not necessarily mean you've got to replace the entire whole track, right? But generally it'd only be pads you'd save. If the chain is worn, you definitely want to be replacing the sprocket, and that generally goes for rubber pads as rubber tracks as well. It depends on why they've broken, because sometimes rubber tracks can break after 1,000 or so hours, not very long. So you might not have worn the sprocket out and it may not need one, but always check your sprocket, because the teeth get very sharp and it won't engage fully with a new track, and then you end up excessively wearing that track down. And it's particularly important on steel tracks. I'll just show you what I mean with the sprocket. So this one actually has really good teeth. You see, we've got a nice flat bit here. They're not too pointy. They need to go to the dentist when they get too worn out like that. And you also end up, and I'll point it out down here. So you got your pad there. That all can be removed. Here's your chain, and you've got each link of the chain here. Now, these top bits can obviously wear a bit, but generally what actually wears is this pin here, where it meshes on the tooth, and you end up basically seeing the metal here, because that's like a sleeve with a pin going through it. Again, they can't be greased or anything, so these things they live a horrendous life, to be honest. But yeah, that's the deal. So if you see you've got teeth here that are really pointy, and you can see wear here where potentially you can see through this bit of metal onto the insert of it. To be honest, it needs new chains, and it'll definitely need a new sprocket. And on machines like this, that can cost a few grand. So worth keeping an eye on. Now, when it comes to rubber tracks, there's several things that you can do to extensively prolong the life of your tracks. There is no age that these things fail at. It really is dependent upon use. And some people will wear the tread blocks out on them if they're doing a lot of road work, for example. They might never see the mud or any stones, and they'll wear the rubber out before they snap the track. And other people, myself included, snapped what looked like a perfectly good track, and it literally just snapped in half. I've even, on my other machine, my old 801, I actually ended up ripping the cleats out of that. So, the rubber fails and the metal cleats come out, and there's all kinds of things you can do to these things. But there are some easy tips, I guess, to try and prolong your tracks. Now, you're never going to be in a situation where you think, I won't do that job because it might damage my track. I appreciate that. But if you're aware of some easy things that you can do to try and, just give them a little bit of consideration, you'll find that you'll get a lot more life for it out of even the best quality tracks. And the poorer quality track you have, the worse these points will be. So I'll run you through them. Now, the first one, probably the easiest one to mention, is surfaces. Now, this is right next to the machine. It's a prime example. You've got a bit of block work here sticking up. Now, yeah, you could track over that. It might track flat. But chances are that's going to sit. And what it'll do is it'll sit underneath here, and it'll push this track up and stress it and put like a kink in it. And that is stretching. You've got cords inside this track, remember? Wires that run all the way around. And that's what stretches them. It can break them. It can cut the track. If you get any cuts and abrasions, I'll talk about them in a second. But, all of that can damage your cords. And that's how you end up sort of splitting a track, which is what I did with my first machine. Now, let's face it, we track over rough ground all the time. That's what these things are for. My point here is that you just try and avoid, if you were, let's say, sat on a curb edge or something, and you had the machine half on the curb, half off, and if you put your blade down and you level yourself up a bit, you're maybe putting the pressure on an idler or a sprocket at each end, instead of that kind of sharp edge in the middle of the tracks. It'll make your machine life operating a hell of a lot better, you're driving better, and it'll also prolong your tracks a bit. So just be considerate of these things. The same goes, actually, if you sit against a curb and you end up with the side of the track half on a curb, etc. That can really split a track. And I had a Kubota, had done 300 odd hours, I think, at the time, I hired recently that had that happen to it. So, 300 hours old, those tracks should be virtually mint. And they had huge splits in them, which the water will get in. Again, it'll damage the cords inside here, and that track will probably fail within 1,000 hours, I would have thought, purely from just bad driving. So that's how much it can it can affect them. And you might think, oh, I didn't get a very good life out of those, but it can honestly be the difference in how you go about operating them. So debris, that's another one. Again, the same principle. If you get loads of stuff caught in the tracks, it's going to stretch your track. And if you stretch your track, that's where you have issues. And again, if you've got any weak spots, they will essentially rip apart, which, as you know, is what happened to the first set I had on my old 8026 rather. Clogging, if you are in, let's say it's frozen conditions, they're full of mud, the cold weather we had earlier this year in January, Christmas, before Christmas, that was a prolonged cold snap, wasn't it? And as a result, people, mud gets stuck in your tracks, it freezes up. Nightmare, absolute nightmare. And I did see some people on Facebook whose machines were unfortunately stuck to the ground. Well, that happens. It's not going to do your tracks any good either, because you're likely to then try and sort of jam it backwards and forwards to try and get it moving. It's not a good look, and it doesn't do your tracks any good. So I would always say when you're in cold weather, especially prolonged cold weather, that is, a -1 overnight's not going to do it. But when we had -3, -4 for nearly 2 weeks, everything will freeze solid, and that's where it starts to go wrong. Now, tension is another classic one. People can over tension their tracks, think, oh, I'll stop them coming off, I'll pump them right up. Well, again, all you're doing is stressing that cord that's in here, stretching it. The tracks will stretch over time anyway, and that's why we have to check the adjustment. But you'll overstretch them, they'll get to a point where there is no more stretching to be done, and they will eventually rip in half. So you can actually think you're doing a good thing and maybe not. So make sure you know what the setting should be. I'll explain in a minute in a section of the video how to check your tension, and make sure it's right, and keep an eye on it, because sometimes, especially when machines are new or tracks are new, these things need adjusting maybe every couple of weeks. This did to start with, and it's settled down now, and then it's something I maybe do every 6 months. But you kind of know when your track's getting a bit loose. They get a bit baggy on the top. This top sort of bit starts to be a little bit baggy when you're stepping on and off it. So it's not impossible to work out, but something to bear in mind. Excess speed is another killer for tracks, and they reckon something stupid. They say, these track manufacturers, like if you are in rabbit mode, twin speed, whatever you want to call it, quick track, you will potentially half the life of your tracks. That's what they reckon. And you see all these machines, don't you, these days, driving around sites with forks on the front, and they're tracking up down roads, and you just think, oh, killing the machine. But anyway, that's the UK construction industry. We now think excavators are forklifts. For some reason, we don't seem to like using a telehandler anymore. That beside, you'll kill your tracks, particularly in twin speed. Now, again, something personally I've never bothered worrying about. I just think, well, I've got a job to do, and I get on with it. I think you're much likely to kill a track much quicker from having it on a very sharp edge, or bad operating like that, or of course turning very sharp. All of that sort of thing is worse for track wear than I think twin speed. But it is a factor nonetheless, and worth knowing. Some people also say about the way that you should operate the track, and I think that particularly applies to steel tracks, which we'll talk about in a second. Rubbers, I think, work pretty well in both directions, really. The other thing, of course, is dozer work. If you've got a lot of dozer work and you're using that blade a lot, of course, some of these machines now, bigger machines, 8-tonners, etc., still have rubber tracks. You will put more stress on your tracks, obviously, and you'll potentially wear them out faster. Again, if it's quicker to use the blade, the tracks are there to be used, aren't they? So I take all of these things with a consideration, rather than like a sort of gospel of, oh, no, I never use the dozer blade, because that's what it's there for, right? Got to get on. But dozer blade in twin speed, you're probably like asking for trouble. So, just be aware, really, is all you can do. My final point with rubber tracks is, when you're transporting them, don't strap them down on the tracks, like over the tops of the tracks. I see this so much, and you're stressing that, and you're pulling down on this area. It's not supported by an idler. You're stretching your track, and as we've said in other forms of ways of stretching it, it's not great. So just don't, because they have proper tie down points. You know, this one has one just here. Use proper tie down points. Don't strap over your tracks. It's not good for them. So when we're talking about rubber tracks, there's several things that you need to know before you could potentially buy a new one. So a bit like car tyres, they come in different sizes. And like a car tyre would come in the rim diameter, width of the tyre, and the profile. Tracks are quite similar, but there's a couple of extra things you need to sort of know, really. That's not to say you can get low profile tracks. I've tried fitting the 20-inch spinners. Remember those? From the back in the day, good old Westwood and his Pimp My Ride. Can't do that on a digger, but you can definitely fit the wrong tracks for sure. So tracks are generally marked on the side. Now my ones actually aren't here, so I can't show you that. Typically JCB don't seem to do it, but normally you would be marked here. There's normally a point on the track. It would say what it is, and what it'll be is your width. It'll give you a width, so that's the overall width of your track here. In this case it's a 300mm track. That I know because I'm just sad like that. You get the pitch. Now the pitch is to do with the amount of times that the track engages with the idlers or the sprockets. This machine has an idler that has a sprocket on it, essentially. All 8026s seem to have that. I don't know why. Most of them have got a kind of smooth wheel at the idler end, and then you have your traditional sort of sprocket end, which is here. So you imagine short pitch tracks engage with every single one of these links. So as it goes round, you've got bars here, and each of those teeth are meshing with each part of that. Long pitch tracks are generally a little bit cheaper in my experience. They've got less metal in them, and they engage every other tooth. So the cleats, as you would potentially say, are wider. Hence, I guess the long pitch term. I assume that's how it works. But they are a wider cleat. People say that they're maybe better on rougher ground, or they're a tougher track because there's more metal. I don't know. Personally, short pitch tracks, especially with modern machines with 2-speed tracking and things, they engage a lot nicer. They're a lot smoother to run, especially when you're on the harder surfaces, etc. And I suspect most modern machines now will run short pitch tracks. But something you need to know. So you would have a number for a track like this, for example. It might say 300, of course that's the width of the track, and then you get your pitch, which is the distance between your sprocket, the pitch fit essentially, of your the way it engages, and then your number of links. So it might be a 372, I don't know, 60 or something, because that's the amount of times it engages around the track. Obviously the bigger the track, the more links it'll have, etc. That's just a completely random made up number, by the way. I can't actually remember what this machine runs, but I have got a note of it somewhere. The great thing is when you ring up a company like I did when I broke my old machine, I broke my tracks, I rang JCB and they quoted me a stupid lead time for tracks, and of course you're sat there with a broken track, you need to get on, don't you? So I rang Digbits and got those Camso tracks I've featured in another video. That's not these actually were fitted by JCB on this machine as standard. Well, it wasn't a standard, I had to get them to do it, but they should have fitted it standard. Anyway, they were fitted by JCB, so that's why they're JCB tracks. They don't have the numbers on them. But you ring up a company like Digbits, they know these machines. You can quote serial number at them, and they know that they change. I know 8026s have got a couple of different sizes of track on them potentially. Anyway, they've got a great database, and any track company like that would have, so yeah, worth knowing what your machine is, giving them a call, and generally they'll give you a couple of options of what it could be, and you can kind of narrow it down from that, so you don't have to start completely from nothing. So yeah, that's basically the deal. You're looking to replace your tracks. You just need to know whether they're short or long pitch, and then what your 3 sizes are. So yeah, that's tracks really. Otherwise, it's just quality of rubber. Various things I found on tracks over the years. My old 801 had long pitch tracks, and I bought some cheap ones on that, and I sort of regretted it really in the end. I should have bought something of a better quality, because they ended up splitting and various things. Again, you can see that in the used mini excavator video I did, which featured my old 8015. But at the time, you learn these lessons, don't you? So I tend to fit the best rubber I can these days, and Dig Bits do those Excavator Tracks. They're owned by the Michelin Group, so I never had a problem with them. They did more hours than the original Tracks did, and I was very pleased with them. Obviously, this time I spec'd this machine with the 300mm Tracks that I wanted. So yeah, that's working out and selecting what rubber track you want. So we come on to track tension, and this varies model to model, and really you want to look up in your handbook if you've got it. If you don't have it, Facebook groups, etc. are great for things such as that. Ask around and find out, because it can vary model to model, manufacturer to manufacturer, and different types of track, of course, depending on the setting it requires. But the setting is always the same, and that is measured down here, so underneath your lower bottom roller, and the track itself. Now, this track is actually pretty well tensioned. I've jacked the machine up using its own hydraulics here, and I'm making sure I'm going to stay well clear of this little area. You do need to jack yourself up. Of course, it's easy to do it with its own under its own power. You then want to just rotate your tracks, just to make sure you haven't got any stones or anything caught in your sprockets and your idlers, so that the track is essentially fitting snugly, and it's not, it doesn't fool you into thinking it's tighter than it is. There's no mud building up in the sprockets that's sort of extra tensioning the track. Then you can adjust this to the measurement. Now, this machine is really simply done, and a lot are like this, particularly once you get over kind of 1.5 ton. They're all done by grease, so you just need a grease gun. On my machine, take this port off here. It's got a grease nipple like you find on the boom and everywhere else that you would grease your machine, and you'll find that one pump will do quite a lot, so don't go crazy, and I'd be very careful with those electric grease guns that fire quite a bit of grease in over time. So yeah, go gently, little bit at a time, and you'll start to see the track expand. Now, you want to be careful here not to over tighten your tracks. You might think, well, it keeps coming loose, I'll just get it tighter and then it won't come off anymore, will it? Well, actually, you can do a lot of damage to a track by over tightening it. You can also do a lot of damage to the idler, because these things have basically got a ram inside full of grease. That expands, the idler expands out in that direction, tensions the track. That's basically how this works. So I'd be very careful of over tightening. If anything, for me, you'd want them a little bit looser, because you get a lot of stones and things, as I say, get caught in your idlers. If you tighten your tracks so that there's no gap here and this is all nice and tight, seems great now, but you get it in a bit of sand, shingle, or whatever these things tend to work in, and suddenly you'll actually be trying to tear your track apart, because it won't have that little bit of slack it needs to expand when gear gets stuck between the idler and the track. So careful of that. If your tracks are constantly coming loose and therefore coming off, then I suggest you've probably got an issue with the idler and the ram behind that, and it could well be that the seals have failed. That does happen sometimes, especially of course on older machines. Some machines, like I mentioned, they're not all grease operated like this. Some are tensioned with a big spring, and you have essentially two nuts, like a lock nut and another nut. They're quite a pain actually, and generally they're on micro diggers and track barrows and small stuff. Getting in there, you never have enough access. You're trying to tighten these things up, and that is hard work. So yeah, can't say anything but good luck with that. But the grease system is really easy. It takes literally 2 minutes to do both sides of the machine when you're not doing a video and explaining it like I am.